Welcome back. Climate change is one of the most pressing challenges of our time, and it requires both global and local action. In Brooklyn, one organization is leading the charge by mobilizing everyday people to take impactful steps in their communities. This group is focused on reducing climate pollution, promoting renewable energy, and ensuring that the most vulnerable New Yorkers are not left behind. Joining us is a director of Artichoke Dance Company and steering committee member at 350 Brooklyn, Lynn Neuman. Lynn, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm delighted to be here in conversation with you.
Now, how does 350 Brooklyn mobilize volunteers to take effective local action on the climate crisis?
We do that through working groups. And so we have a variety of working groups that people can plug into. We're a volunteer driven organization. And that means that if there isn't a working group that you have a particular affinity to, and you have an idea of something that you want to work on and are willing to take charge of it and mobilize others around it, we will embrace that. So currently, we're working on in coalition with many other organizations, and that's generally how we do our work. Working singularly is not as effective as working collaboratively, and we know this. So we have various initiatives in Brooklyn and globally, like the Eastern African Crude Oil Pipeline, EACOP, which is also known. We're part of that battle. And then locally, as a oppositionally to that, very hyper local initiative to help Brooklyn College green its energy sources and become carbon neutral. And then at the state level, we work on all sorts of bills, particularly with New York Renews, which is a large coalition of environmental organizations that work across the state.
Now, you mentioned that working in collaboration with other climate groups makes more of an impact, and obviously it's better to work as a team than individually. Can you talk a little bit more about that experience and how it helps everyone kind of reach that goal?
Sure. So, working in collaboration with others, particularly in diverse groups of folks, brings a lot of perspectives to the table. I can only bring my own lived experience, as everyone can. And I don't know everything, right? And we acknowledge that as an organization. We don't know everything, and we don't represent all perspectives. So it's super important that people come together so we can encompass those different perspectives. But also, if you look at what we're working around, which is climate, although it's completely intertwined with all sorts of other justice issues, right? Um, uh, it's if you as a single person, like, you're not going to solve a solution by just bringing your own cup, right? It might make a dent, but you're not going to solve plastic pollution if you bring your own cup, right? So it needs to be a larger movement with people working on the issues from a lot of different angles and a lot of different sides. So that's the importance of working in collaboration coalition with people, is bringing diverse perspectives, different lived experiences, and then having many, many voices working on it in organizations from different angles.
Now, what specific actions does the organization take to ensure low income New Yorkers and environmental justice communities benefit from the shift to renewable energy?
So, working again in coalition and collaboration, and we have a large legislative committee. One of the bills that we helped to get passed with the New York News Coalition was the Climate CLCPA, Climate Legislation and Community Protection Act, which within it has a large mandate for environmental justice. Now, mandates are only as good, we know, are only as good as their implementation. There was a recent report that came out from New York Lawyers for the Public Interest that was tracking how agencies are implementing environmental justice mandates and initiatives, and it turns out they're not doing so well. So this is something we're starting to turn our attention to. They're legally bound to, but if no one's holding their feet to the fire, and we know this from a lot of rezonings in and around New York City, then not everything gets implemented, right? So there's multiple stages and multiple steps to it. There's legislative, there's on the ground action, there's implementation. So there's all these different layers and levels, and we try to work at many of them.
And speaking of all those different layers and levels, how does 350 Brooklyn balance its focus?
Again, it's driven by the volunteers and because our origination was as a chapter of 350 Brooklyn. 350 is a national organization that is mainly focused on fossil fuel mitigation and green energy growth. So that has always been one of our platforms. That's not necessarily driven by the national organization. We act autonomously. It's kind of a, by brand only an association. But we, sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
Well, that's okay. Well, yeah, I wanted to know because when we're talking about climate change, there's so many different areas and layers. It can be overwhelming for anybody to kind of think about. So I was curious to know, how the organization kind of balance its focus.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you
Hmm.
for getting me on track. Yeah, so things that where we feel like we can either contribute in a significant way to something that's larger, global, or state level, or that something that's very local where people will see an impact right here, right now, not necessarily right now, but right here in Brooklyn, within a few years. I can give a couple of examples of that. So at the very local level, we were working quite strongly with Councilman Sandy Nurse, who had proposed several waste reduction strategies, and one of which was imposing residential composting. So we've had commercial composting in New York City for some time, but to take it to the residential level. And so we worked with her and her team to get other council folks on board through both our legislative committee, and we have what's called a power hour, which is where some folks put together a bunch of materials. You dial into the power hour, they give you the script, you call folks, you email folks, and basically advocate for whatever is whatever is pressing that particular week. So it's very easy activism, and you're learning as you're going, right? And so that passed actually fairly quickly once there was enough folks behind it. And now throughout New York City, we have residential composting.
Now, for our next topic, I think is super important to highlight because prior to, kind of doing this work and having these conversations, I was very surprised to see that racism is somehow linked to some of the environmental injustices we see in our city. How does the organization integrate anti-racism and inclusivity into its climate activism work?
So you're absolutely right. We talk about environmental justice, which is inextricably linked with racial justice, economic justice, geographic justice, gender justice. And historically, environmental justice was aligned with the civil rights movement, at least in the modern contingent part of it, of the history of environmental justice, which is a very long history. It didn't start in the 60s. But I think climate change is a problem, but it is also an outcome of some of systemic problems and systemic ways of doing things, right? And that is neoliberal capitalism, these kind of larger systems that we could say climate change is a symptom of, racism, heteropatriarchy, and colonialism. And so all those systems which are oppressed people, right, have caused this thing called climate change that is now yet another problem, right? So the inextricably linkedness of it all, yes. So we can't talk about climate change without talking about these other things and without talking about racial injustices. And as we know, there's a lot of this in the media and in general culture. Communities of color, low-income communities bear the brunt of climate change. And this is both here in the United States and globally, and have done the least to contribute to the problem.
And can you just very quickly give us an example of what that may look like in a community?
Sure. I'll use Gowanus as an example. I have worked with the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice for many years, both around the canal remediation. So the Gowanus Canal is New York City's first Superfund site, named by the Environmental Protection Agency because of its extreme pollution. It is now being remediated in the process of remediation, and around the rezoning. So when the rezoning parameters, the geographic parameters came out, one block right at the division line of what was considered the rezoning area, just on the other side of that line were the three NYCHA public housing campuses that are in Gowanus. So one of the things with a rezoning is there can be a lot of community benefits that get negotiated as part of a larger scale rezoning. And that's why some communities opt to do them so that they can reap some of those benefits. But in the design of the rezoning, NYCHA was excluded from that. And we said, wait a minute, this is completely like, this is completely backwards. And quite frankly, the NYCHA housing campuses still have not been completely remediated from Hurricane Sandy, and that was over a decade ago. So we made it a priority to bring into our list of demands that the number one was upfront capital funding to fix NYCHA housing. And when we first started that battle, we were told by the Department of City Planning, oh, not our jurisdiction, right? Because NYCHA is part of a federal program. It's not a city program. And we're like, well, it's going to be our problem, right? Because we're making it so. And through many negotiations and building a lot of people power on the ground, it got fully funded. So, that's also the power of a coalition and people coming together to really call out. And I think that's particularly of someone who has my skin color, right? Black people should not be the only people that are fighting for racial justice. Everybody should be fighting for racial justice and making the really discrete points that, like, this is an unjust thing, right? And I need to be saying that, as well as people of color.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think a huge part of that, as I mentioned before I even brought up the topic, was that I didn't know. And so that education is super important when we are combating these things. Can you just explain what types of educational programs 350 Brooklyn offer to help people understand the climate crisis and everything that goes along with it?
Sure. So we have member meetings where we will often bring speakers in to educate us and our members, and anyone is welcome to those meetings. Most of them happen on Zoom post pandemic, although, can we even really say that this is post pandemic? Uh, and some happen in person. And we have speakers series. But from my own experience, the best way to become educated around it is just get involved. I'll go back to my example about Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice. I knew nothing about the city planning process and the rezoning process until I started getting involved in that. And boy, did I get an education just by being present and working my way through the process with other people. So I think the best way, if you're interested in learning about things, is volunteer, show up, and it takes a while. Like, I had to do a lot of listening before I could get to a point where I could even form an opinion about it, because I didn't know that much. But for me, I like to learn by doing. I'm a doer. So yeah, there are plenty of opportunities. There's so much online now, of webinars and talks and things like that. And so many people have written books, and there's podcasts. But for me, if you're an action-oriented person, like, getting involved with other people is the best way to learn, I think.
And when we're online, can you just quickly give us a tip on how we can avoid misinformation, especially when we're dealing with a topic like climate change?
Yeah. Um, you know, uh, there is a lot of expert folks, and I would say, like, go to the science. Um, there, so if a politician is talking about something, you can usually Google a couple of buzzwords that they're talking about, and then get some pretty um, comprehensive scientific information around it. With this age of the internet and now AI, it's pretty easy to weed out the sound bites if you go to the science.
Thank you so much for that. Now, you talked about, just doing it pretty much, and how you can be a volunteer. How does 350 Brooklyn ensure that volunteers find meaningful and satisfying work while contributing to the climate movement?
Yeah, so again, I'll go back to my first example about being volunteer driven. So there are buckets or areas of work. So if like you want to work on legislative and policy things, if you want to work more at the community level on mitigating past pollution locally, that's how um, that uh, that working group works. If you're interested in kind of like more behind the scenes and putting materials together for advocacy things. So I like to point to one thing that Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson has, a triple Venn diagram. So she wrote the book All We Can Save, which I highly recommend. And she just came out with another book that's called What If We Get It Right? That I'm just going to start diving into. So I'll plug those too. But her triple Venn diagram is ask yourself three questions: what brings you joy? What are you good at? And what needs to be done? And if you find the intersectional point of those three things, like that's where you're going to do your best work, right? Something you're interested in, something you're good at, and something that needs to be done. So we try to use something like that, right? Your interests, where you see a problem lies, and what you're good at, and then fold those together.
Well, Lynn, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this very important discussion. I know that, talks about climate change are especially important all over, but definitely here in the Bronx as well, since many of our residents do face the effects of climate change. So with that, again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Absolutely. We in Brooklyn are your neighbor in the Bronx, and we see the parallels that are happening between these communities. And anyone from the Bronx who is interested in partnering with us, please reach out. You can reach us through our website at 350brooklyn.org. We'd love to work with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have to take a quick break. We'll be back right after this.